How do you handle things outside and inside your control? I recently ordered this off of Temu, along with a feelings wheel for my office at my practicum site for counseling. And we have discussed this in school a few quarters ago. And what this is things outside my control, which is the outer ring, and things inside my control. The things outside my control are other people's thoughts, other people's actions, other people's feelings, other people's words, other people's ideas, other people's behaviors, other people's play, and other people's opinions. Now let's look at that. This morning would be a good example for me. This morning I had an interaction with my son. We're both autistic. And I had mentioned that to both my kids, really, when they get home from school, they need to get their chores done. My son automatically got annoyed and said, "I know," just like that. And so my mirror neurons fired off, and I reflected that energy back at him. Not the greatest parenting move. And it wasn't until we got to the school, after I had already lectured him about how he treats me whenever I tell him to do something, that I began to realize that I needed to de-escalate this situation. Otherwise, it's going to set the tone for his entire day at school. Now, in this situation, the things outside of my control was his reaction to what I told him to do. That would be other people's behavior, other people's actions, other people's thoughts, other people's feelings. That's the things outside of my control. So his reaction was outside of my control. Now, what was inside my control were my actions, my thoughts, my ideas, my words, my feelings, my opinions, my behavior, my play. The way I handled it this morning wasn't the best. Us both being autistic, it can make for a somewhat toxic relationship, because when he gets overstimulated, I get overstimulated. When he begins to melt down, I begin to melt down. When he's feeling a certain way, I mirror that. And so, by the time I had a chance to reset, to think about how the morning was going, I told him, "I'm sorry for the way I acted this morning. I want to be treated the way you want to be treated." I don't know if that helped or not. I don't know if I could have done that better. I am still trying to reframe the way I speak, especially to my children. I'm trying to get that "but" out of my vocabulary. I'm trying to use the "yes and," that I've been learning in school. Yes, I upset you. And you upset me. Yes, we upset each other. And we can move on from this more positively. It can be difficult because everyone has mirror neurons. We all react to certain stimuli, certain actions, certain language. We tend to project other people's actions, emotions, feelings, words back at them. And for those of us who are neurodivergent, it can be much more difficult because it's amplified, because we're so used to masking that and trying to be quote unquote normal. That we don't even realize when we're being toxic because we're doing what we learned. Many of us have found a way to get through the way we were parented and not parent the same way. Others, however, like myself, really struggle with it because it was so ingrained into us that it's become a part of who we are. And now we have to try and remold our brains, remanipulate how we experience things. We have to change the things inside of our control. Because before we understood that we were neurodivergent, if we're late diagnosed, these things weren't really inside of our control. Our actions, our thoughts, our feelings. They were to an extent, but we wanted to be accepted. We wanted to assimilate into society. And so oftentimes we do the exact same thing that was done to us. And yes, it is within our control to an extent, but it's also outside of our control until we understand ourselves better. I'm still working on this. I'm still working on trying to understand myself better, and by extent, trying to understand my son better. I understand the whole PDA profile, the persistent drive for autonomy or pathological demand avoidance profile, where you can't just tell somebody or ask somebody to do something. You have to give them options, because there's this whole drive for autonomy. But at the same time, that old way of doing things is so ingrained into us. It's like carved into stone. Our brains have neuroplasticity in them. They are neuroplastic, meaning they can reshape themselves. Not physically, but the neurotransmitters can be modified. But the older you get, the harder it is for that neuroplasticity to be modified. It's not impossible. It just takes a lot more effort, a lot more time, a lot more understanding, a lot more patience. A year ago, 2 years ago, even when my oldest was growing up, I didn't understand all this. I was a toxic parent because I didn't understand myself and how everything around me, from the way I was parented to the way people perceived me to the way I perceived the world, and my mirroring of all that affected my parenting and ultimately affected my relationship with my oldest. Now that I understand my neurodivergence, my autism, now that I understand there are other ways to parent and the reasons behind them, I can try to do better. And I've been working on that. But it's a long road. It's a difficult road because oftentimes we tend to move back into old patterns. In addictions counseling, there's a thing called stages of change. It's pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance, and relapse. When it comes to parenting, many of us who are set in our ways can be in the pre-contemplation stage. This is where we have no intention of changing our behaviors. We think what we're doing is right, is the only way. And then eventually we move into contemplation, where we become aware of the problem, that there is a problem, and consider making the change. Then we move into preparation. This is when we're ready to make the change and maybe gathering information in order to do it. Then we take action. We've made the observable changes, or we're making the observable changes. And it's like a 6-month period, generally speaking. And then we go into maintenance. This is where we've integrated the new behavior into our life and we feel comfortable with it. But there's also relapse. We start to fall back to our old ways. And it can be discouraging whenever we do fall back into our old ways. There's a doctor who's written several books about child psychology, essentially, especially in school and parenting. His name's Dr. Ross Greene. And I really love his method of parenting, of teaching, of working with kids. And he gives great examples of how the stages of change develop through the interactions, and how we can often, no matter how educated and experienced we are with a given, whether it be parenting or teaching or the new way of doing things, we're all capable of relapse. And I think the most important part is to acknowledge it and understand it and to try to do better going forward.